What you're about to discover will leave you breathless. A scandal so audacious it sent shockwaves through England's highest circles. When one of the realm's most powerful dukes made an unthinkable decision, no one could have predicted the consequences that would shake the very foundations of aristocratic society. This is a story of deception, forbidden love, and a desperate father's gamble that risked everything: his title, his reputation, his fortune, all for something money could never buy. If you're fascinated by the secret lives of Victorian nobility, the hidden dramas behind closed ballroom doors, subscribe to the channel now, because what happened next changed not just one family, but challenged the rigid boundaries that separated England's elite from those they ruled. The scent of roses drifted through Ashbourne House's marble corridors that Thursday morning, mingling with beeswax polish and the faint smoke from coal fires burning in every grate. His Grace Edmund Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, stood at his study window overlooking Hyde Park, watching carriages roll past in an endless parade of London's fashionable elite, a world he suddenly found himself despising with unexpected intensity. His Grace Edmund Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, possessed everything English society deemed valuable. At 37 duels, he controlled estates spanning 3 counties, held investments in railways and shipping concerns that generated obscene wealth, and commanded respect in Parliament's House of Lords. His London residence occupied an entire block of Mayfair's most prestigious square, staffed by 47 servants who moved through its rooms like well-trained ghosts. None of it mattered when he heard his son's footsteps approaching, slow, hesitant, completely devoid of childhood energy. 7-year-old Thomas appeared in the doorway of the ducal study, already dressed in his formal jacket and short trousers, prepared for another day at the exclusive academy where future peers learned Latin, Greek, and aristocratic detachment. The boy clutched a crumpled letter in small hands that trembled slightly. "Father, the headmaster requests parental attendance at Friday's presentation," Thomas said, his voice carrying that terrible flatness that had become permanent these past months. The theme concerns family composition and maternal influences. Edmund felt his throat constrict painfully. Thomas had lost his mother, the Duchess Catherine, 5 years prior to complications following childbirth. Since that devastating loss, Edmund had attempted fulfilling dual parental roles, but his naturally reserved temperament, combined with aristocratic training in emotional restraint, had created an unbridgeable chasm between father and son. The boy was drowning in grief, transforming into a miniature adult far too soon, losing the spark that should define childhood. "What will your presentation address?" Edmund asked, attempting warmth his education had never taught him to express. "I shall discuss Mamma, who resides in heaven," Thomas replied with heartbreaking directness. However, Fitzgerald Minor claims that doesn't satisfy assignment parameters, because authentic mothers arrange one's hair each morning, apply medicinal treatment to scraped knees, and narrate bedtime stories. His mother, Lady Fitzgerald, performs all these functions. Those words echoed through Edmund's mind during the formal breakfast, served in the dining room's oppressive silence. He observed his son consuming eggs and toast under the governess Mrs. Pemberton's supervision, noting with painful clarity how maternal absence was destroying the natural joy children should possess. Thomas never smiled, never raced through corridors creating chaos, never engaged in mischief. He was obedient, respectful, and tragically adult at 7 years old. The problem wasn't shortage of candidates for the position of Duchess, quite the opposite. Edmund received constant invitations to soirees, balls, and formal dinners. Elegant widows, prosperous merchants, accomplished daughters, even distant cousins from established families, made their interest abundantly clear in the matrimonial market's most eligible bachelor across 3 counties. Every single one shared a characteristic that disgusted Edmund profoundly. They treated Thomas as an inconvenient obstacle requiring tolerance, never as a child desperately needing genuine maternal affection. That evening, Edmund made a decision that would have scandalized every peer in England had they known. He would remove his title, his fortune, his entire identity from the equation. He would discover who might love him, and more importantly, who might love Thomas, when stripped of every aristocratic advantage that had defined him since birth. The gambit was dangerous, potentially catastrophic for his reputation, completely unprecedented in their social sphere. But watching his son fade emotionally, day by day, Edmund realized he would risk anything, even everything, for one chance at finding authentic love in a world built entirely on calculated advantage. 3 weeks of meticulous planning transformed His Grace Edmund Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, into William Grey, a recently widowed tenant farmer seeking employment on the vast Ashbourne country estate in Derbyshire, 200 miles from London's watchful eyes. The transformation required more than different clothing. Edmund studied his tenants, speech patterns, their mannerisms, the callouses honest labour created on working hands. He acquired worn boots, patched jackets, shirts that had seen countless washings until the fabric grew soft and thin. His solicitor, Mr. Blackwood, arranged the elaborate deception with horrified disapproval, installing Edmund in a modest stone cottage on the estate's furthest boundary, where dense woodland separated it from the main house. The cottage consisted of 3 rooms, a combined kitchen and living area, a small bedroom and an even smaller chamber for Thomas. After Ashbourne House's palatial grandeur, the space felt suffocatingly tiny. The ceiling beams hung low enough that Edmund struck his head twice the first morning. The stone floor radiated cold despite the fireplace, and the narrow windows admitted barely enough light for reading. Thomas adapted with surprising enthusiasm. "It's like an adventure from my storybooks, Father," the boy said, exploring every corner with more animation than Edmund had witnessed in months. "We're like knights in disguise, aren't we?" "Precisely," Edmund agreed, grateful his son found excitement rather than deprivation in their circumstances. "But remember, here, I'm simply William Grey. Can you manage that?" "Yes, sir." "I mean, yes, Father William." Thomas giggled at the strangeness of it. The estate steward, Mr. Harrison, accepted the newcomer with practical indifference. "Grey, you'll work the Northfields during harvest season. Morning assembly occurs at dawn. Wages distributed Saturday evenings. Chapel attendance Sunday mornings is expected, not optional." Edmund nodded obediently, suppressing lifelong instincts to command rather than comply. His first morning labouring in the fields nearly destroyed the entire charade. Edmund had ridden across his estates countless times, had reviewed crop reports and profit calculations, had discussed agricultural theory with other landowners over port and cigars. He'd never actually worked the soil with his own hands. The other men noticed immediately. "You hold that scythe like it's a lady's fan," observed a weathered farmer named Joseph, though his tone carried amusement rather than mockery. "Here, let me demonstrate proper technique before you slice off your own leg." Edmund accepted the correction with humility that felt foreign yet strangely liberating. For the first time in his aristocratic existence, his title meant nothing. His wealth purchased no deference. His ancient family name commanded no automatic respect. He was simply William, a man who must prove his worth through effort, not inheritance. The village of Millbrook, serving the estate's 100 families, occupied a valley where the River Derwent curved through limestone cliffs. Stone cottages clustered around a Norman church, a village green, and a marketplace that came alive each Wednesday with vendors selling produce, fabric, pottery, and livestock. Edmund discovered a world his privilege had hidden. Neighbours shared what little they possessed when illness or misfortune struck. Children played freely in the dirt, shrieking with laughter, their games requiring nothing but imagination. Evening gatherings featured storytelling, simple music, genuine fellowship that London's glittering ballrooms never achieved, despite their crystal chandeliers and champagne fountains. And there was Charlotte Hartwell. Charlotte Hartwell possessed neither fortune nor aristocratic connections, yet she commanded respect throughout Millbrook through sheer force of character. At 23, she managed her father's weaving business after illness had weakened Robert Hartwell's once steady hands, transforming their modest operation into the estate's most reliable source of quality fabric. Edmund first encountered her at the village well on his 3rd morning, struggling to draw water with technique that betrayed his inexperience. The rope burned his soft palms, the bucket tilted awkwardly, and half the contents sloshed across his boots before reaching ground level. "You're approaching it incorrectly," a feminine voice observed. May I demonstrate?" He turned to find a young woman in a simple grey dress, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, watching him with eyes the colour of spring moss. Intelligent, direct and remarkably kind. Her hands showed evidence of honest work, yet she moved with unconscious grace that would have suited any London drawing room. "I would be grateful," Edmund admitted, stepping aside. Charlotte took the rope with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and sure. Within moments, she'd drawn a full bucket without spilling a drop. The technique requires steady rhythm rather than brute strength. Like weaving, consistent tension produces superior results to sporadic force. "You're a weaver, then?" "My father owns the workshop near the church. I manage the business operations." She studied him with frank curiosity. "You're the new tenant in Blackwood Cottage, William Gray, recently widowed, with a young son. The village talks, Mr. Gray. We're a small community where everyone knows everything eventually." "Not everything, I hope," Edmund said, then realized how that sounded. "I meant, some sorrows deserve privacy." Something softened in her expression. "Yes, they do. I lost my mother 6 years ago. People mean well with their constant sympathy, but sometimes grief needs quiet space to breathe." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas, racing across the village green with 3 local boys in pursuit, all of them laughing. Edmund barely recognized his son, face flushed, hair dishevelled, jacket abandoned somewhere, completely absorbed in childhood joy. "Your boy seems happy," Charlotte observed, smiling at the children's antics. "He hasn't laughed like that in years," Edmund admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. "His mother's death affected him profoundly. I've tried everything, but nothing reached him until we came here." Charlotte watched Thomas with an expression Edmund couldn't quite interpret, something tender and sad simultaneously. Children need more than material provision. They need to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, loved enough to risk joy again. Sometimes a change of environment provides that safety. The boys tumbled to a halt near the well, breathing hard. Thomas's face glowed with exertion and happiness. "Father, I mean, Papa, this is Jack, and Peter, and Samuel. They're teaching me how to skip stones properly. I've never learned before. May I practice with them at the river?" "Stay where I can see you from the cottage," Edmund instructed, his heart swelling at his son's transformation. As the children raced off, Charlotte said quietly, "He calls you both Father and Papa. That's unusual." Edmund cursed his carelessness internally. Old habits from his early childhood. "I'm attempting to encourage the less formal address." "It's sweet," Charlotte said, her gaze following Thomas's retreating figure. "He's a beautiful child. Those eyes, so much depth for someone so young. He's experienced real pain, hasn't he?" "More than any child should," Edmund agreed truthfully. Charlotte turned back to him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "Then we shall have to ensure his time here fills him with better memories, Mr. Gray. Every child deserves joy." Summer transformed the Derbyshire countryside into a masterpiece of green and gold. Wheat fields rippled like silk under warm breezes, wildflowers painted the meadows in purple and yellow, and the River Derwent sparkled beneath endless blue skies. Edmund found himself working the land with increasing competence, his hands developing genuine calluses, his shoulders gaining strength from honest labour. But it was the evenings he cherished most, when the village gathered for simple pleasures that his London existence had never provided. Charlotte began teaching Thomas to read more advanced texts, arriving at Blackwood Cottage 3 evenings weekly, with books borrowed from the church library. Edmund would watch from the kitchen, ostensibly preparing their modest supper, while she sat with his son at the rough wooden table, her patient voice guiding him through difficult passages. "Sound it out slowly, Thomas. Don't rush. Every word deserves its proper attention." The boy would concentrate fiercely, his small finger tracing beneath each line, until comprehension dawned and his face brightened with achievement. Charlotte celebrated every success as though he'd conquered Latin itself, and Thomas bloomed under her genuine encouragement. "You're remarkably patient with him," Edmund observed one evening after Thomas had fallen asleep, exhausted from a day spent helping Joseph repair stone walls. They sat outside the cottage, watching fireflies dance above the darkening garden. "He's remarkably eager to learn," Charlotte replied. "There many children resist education, but Thomas absorbs knowledge like parched earth drinking rain. Someone taught him to love learning early." "His mother," Edmund said softly, the lie tasting bitter. In truth, the Duchess Catherine had employed expensive tutors, but Charlotte's gentle teaching bore no resemblance to those formal, rigid lessons. She believed education opened doors that wealth alone couldn't. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman." She was. That much, at least, carried truth. Charlotte turned to face him in the gathering dusk. "May I ask something perhaps too personal?" "You may ask anything. Do you intend to remain here permanently, or is this temporary refuge from grief?" The question struck too close to dangerous territory. Edmund chose his words carefully. "I'm uncertain about permanence, but I know Thomas needs this, needs community, needs simplicity, needs—" He gestured helplessly toward the cottage where his son slept peacefully for the first time in years. "I needs love that doesn't require him to be anything other than himself," Charlotte finished quietly. "Yes, I understand that need." Their eyes met, and Edmund felt something shift fundamentally between them, a recognition, a connection that had nothing to do with social position or calculated advantage. In the warm twilight, with cricket song rising from the grass, he saw Charlotte Hartwell as herself, intelligent, compassionate, beautiful in ways that transcended mere physical appearance. "Charlotte," he said, her given name feeling both presumptuous and absolutely right, "I want you to know—" "Don't," she interrupted gently. "Whatever you're about to say, perhaps we should let it wait. I've learned that words spoken too soon can complicate what might otherwise develop naturally." But Edmund couldn't stop himself. "You've given Thomas something I couldn't provide despite all my resources. You've given him joy again. Whatever happens, I'll be eternally grateful." She smiled, though something sad flickered in her moss-green eyes. "Resources aren't everything, William. Sometimes the greatest gifts cost nothing at all. Attention, patience, genuine care, those can't be purchased." If only she knew how profoundly true those words were, Edmund thought, guilt twisting through his chest like a blade. If only she knew that he'd built their entire relationship on deception, testing her authenticity while hiding his own behind an elaborate mask. As Charlotte departed into the gathering darkness, calling goodnight over her shoulder, Edmund remained outside long after, watching stars emerge above the Derbyshire hills, knowing with terrible certainty that he was falling in love with a woman he was systematically betraying. August arrived with golden heat that shimmered above the harvested fields. Edmund had lived as William Grey for nearly 4 months, and the deception had become almost comfortable. Dangerously so. Thomas thrived completely, transformed from the silent, withdrawn child who'd arrived in spring into a vibrant boy whose laughter rang across the village green daily. And Edmund had fallen irrevocably in love with Charlotte Hartwell. He told himself repeatedly that he would reveal the truth soon, that he would find the right moment to confess everything. But each time he rehearsed the conversation, imagining her inevitable hurt and fury, his courage failed. How could he explain that he'd tested her authenticity, like examining a scientific specimen? That every genuine smile, every kind gesture toward Thomas, every moment of growing affection between them had been observed and evaluated against his aristocratic cynicism. The reckoning arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of gleaming carriages bearing the Wentworth family crest, rolling into Millbrook's dusty high street with an entourage that scattered chickens and drew every villager to their windows. Lord Philip Wentworth, Earl of Hartwick, was Edmund's closest friend from Oxford and frequent hunting companion. His wife, Lady Cordelia, served on the same charitable committees as Edmund in London. They owned the neighbouring estate and had announced their intention to inspect their Derbyshire properties during the summer season. Edmund was working in the North Field when young Peter came racing across the furrows, breathless with excitement. "Mr. Grey, Mr. Grey. There's fancy lords and ladies at the village, carriages with gold paint and everything. They're asking Mr. Harrison about the estate." Cold dread flooded Edmund's veins. He'd instructed his steward that the Duke's presence in Derbyshire must remain absolutely confidential. But Harrison couldn't prevent the Wentworths from touring their own neighbouring lands, or from potentially recognizing Edmund, despite his workman's clothing and sun-darkened skin. He had perhaps 30 minutes before disaster struck. Edmund found Charlotte at her father's workshop, supervising the weaving of a complex damask pattern. "I need to speak with you privately. Immediately. It's urgent." Something in his expression alarmed her. She followed him outside, away from the workshop's curious apprentices, into the narrow alley between buildings. "William, what's wrong? You look terrified." "Charlotte, He stopped, the confession jamming in his throat. How could he possibly explain in mere minutes what required hours? "There are visitors to the estate, aristocratic visitors. They might recognize me from my previous life, before my wife died, when circumstances were different." Her brow furrowed with confusion. "I don't understand. Why would nobility recognize a tenant farmer?" Before Edmund could construct a plausible explanation, catastrophe arrived in the form of Lady Cordelia Wentworth's melodious voice calling across the village square. "Good heavens, Edmund. Edmund Ashbourne, is that truly you beneath all that rustic disguise?" Time seemed to slow impossibly as Charlotte's face transformed, confusion shifting to dawning comprehension, then to horrified betrayal. Around them, villagers began emerging from cottages and shops, drawn by the spectacle of a countess addressing their humble tenant farmer as though he were an equal. Lady Cordelia swept forward, resplendent in violet silk that cost more than most Millbrook families earned in a year. "Darling, we had no idea you were hiding away here. Philip has been searching everywhere for you. When you missed the parliamentary sessions, everyone assumed you'd gone to Scotland, not descended into this quaint little—" She stopped, finally noticing Charlotte's stricken expression and Edmund's anguished one. Oh dear, have I interrupted something frightfully awkward?" Charlotte took a single step backward, her face draining of all colour. "Edmund Ashbourne," she repeated slowly, testing the name, "not William Grey." "Charlotte, please let me explain." "Your Grace," Lady Cordelia corrected automatically. "You really must insist on proper address, even in these rustic circumstances." "Your Grace." Charlotte's voice emerged barely above a whisper. You're a duke." Charlotte stood motionless in the village square as the full magnitude of the deception crashed over her like icy water. Around them, Millbrook's entire population seemed to have materialized, faces pressed against windows, neighbors clustering in doorways, whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "A duke," she repeated, her voice gaining strength and fury with each word. "You're not William Grey's struggling widower seeking honest work. You're His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne, one of England's wealthiest peers, who came here pretending to be common, pretending to be one of us, pretending to be—" Her voice cracked. "Pretending everything. Charlotte, if you'll allow me to explain—" Edmund reached toward her, but she recoiled as though his touch might burn. "Explain what exactly? How you made fools of us all? How you tested my character like examining livestock at market? How you observed my genuine affection as though it were theatre performed for your aristocratic amusement?" Tears glittered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, her spine straight with wounded pride. Lady Cordelia, finally comprehending the disaster she'd created, attempted damage control. "My dear girl, I'm certain His Grace had perfectly reasonable motivations for his unconventional choices. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." "Private?" Charlotte laughed bitterly. "Why should anything be private now? The entire village already knows. By evening, everyone across 3 counties will know that the Duke of Ashbourne came slumming among the peasants, playing dress-up like a child's game, making us all unwitting participants in his social experiment." "It wasn't like that," Edmund protested, desperation making his voice rough. "I came here because Thomas needed—" "Don't you dare use that child as justification." Charlotte's fury blazed hotter. "Thomas is innocent in this. That beautiful boy who finally learned to laugh again, who calls me his friend, who—" She stopped, pressing her hand against her mouth as though physically preventing the words from escaping. But Edmund understood what she hadn't said. Thomas had begun calling Charlotte Mama in unguarded moments this past week, softly testing the word, watching her face anxiously for rejection that never came. Each time, Charlotte had smiled with such tender affection that Edmund's heart had soared with hope. Now that hope lay shattered across the dusty cobblestones, "You made me love him," Charlotte whispered, the accusation more devastating than any shout. "You brought that grieving child into my life. Let me grow attached. Let me believe I might become part of his world. And it was all theatre. I was never going to be his mother. How could I? You're a duke. I'm a weaver's daughter. We exist in completely different universes." "Social position doesn't matter," Edmund began. "Of course it matters," Charlotte interrupted. "It matters because you deliberately hid yours to manipulate my behavior. You wanted to see how I'd treat you without the influence of wealth and title. Well, congratulations, Your Grace. You've successfully proven that I'm not a fortune-hunting schemer. I hope the experiment yielded satisfactory data." Joseph stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his weathered face hard with protective anger. "I think you should leave now, Your Grace. You've done enough damage here." Other villagers murmured agreement, their earlier friendliness toward William Grey transforming into hostility toward the aristocrat who'd deceived them all. Edmund looked around at faces that had welcomed him, shared meals with him, taught him genuine community, now closed against him with the particular coldness reserved for those who betray trust. Thomas appeared at the edge of the crowd, still dressed in the simple clothing he wore for playing with village children, confusion evident on his young face. "Papa, why is everyone angry? Why is Lady Wentworth here?" Charlotte's composure finally cracked. She turned away sharply, one hand covering her face, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Then she fled toward her father's workshop, disappearing inside and slamming the door with finality that echoed across the silent square. Edmund stood frozen, watching her go, knowing he'd destroyed something precious and irreplaceable through his own arrogance and cowardice. Ashbourne House felt like a mausoleum after the simple warmth of Blackwood Cottage. Edmund stood in his palatial study, staring at ledgers and correspondence that had accumulated during his absence, finding them utterly meaningless. The mahogany desk, the leather-bound books lining the walls, the Persian carpets worth more than entire villages, all of it seemed hollow now, purchased comfort that provided no actual solace. Thomas had retreated into silence again, the light extinguished from his eyes as completely as if someone had snuffed a candle. The boy wandered Ashbourne House's endless corridors like a ghost, no longer crying, no longer protesting, simply existing in numb resignation that broke Edmund's heart more thoroughly than any tantrum could have. "She hates us now, doesn't she, Papa?" Thomas asked one evening, his small voice echoing in the cavernous dining room where footmen served courses they barely touched. "Miss Charlotte, she'll never want to see us again." "She's angry," Edmund said carefully, "and she has every right to be. I made terrible choices that hurt her deeply. But you were trying to find someone who would love me for real," Thomas said with devastating perception. "Like those fairy tales where princes disguise themselves to find true love. Only real life isn't like stories, is it? In real life, the disguise just makes everyone hate you." Edmund had no adequate response. His 7-year-old son had just articulated the fundamental flaw in his entire scheme more clearly than Edmund himself could. The summons from his godmother arrived 3 days after their return to London. Lady Beatrice Thornbury, Dowager Countess of Pembroke, suffered fools poorly and relatives even less so. At 73, Boursa, she commanded respect through sheer force of personality and absolutely no patience for aristocratic nonsense. She received Edmund in her drawing room with tea served in porcelain so fine it was nearly transparent, then dismissed her servants with a gesture that brooked no argument. "You spectacular fool," she said without preamble. "Good afternoon to you as well, Aunt Beatrice. Don't be flippant. I've heard about your disastrous provincial adventure from Cordelia Wentworth, who cannot stop gossiping about it across every drawing room in Mayfair. You disguised yourself as a common labourer. Genuinely thought this constituted sound judgment. I was attempting to find authentic affection, uncontaminated by social position," Edmund said wearily, "and instead found authentic fury when your deception was exposed. How utterly predictable." Lady Beatrice poured tea with precise movements. Let me articulate your actual error, since you seem incapable of recognizing it yourself. Your mistake wasn't the disguise. Your mistake was believing you had the right to test another human being's character without offering equal vulnerability in return. Edmund flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. You positioned yourself as judge and arbiter, evaluating this young woman's worthiness while hiding behind false identity. His godmother continued mercilessly. You observed her authenticity while offering nothing authentic yourself. That's not seeking love, Edmund. That's collecting data. That's treating a human heart like a scientific experiment. I know, Edmund whispered. I know that now. Do you? Because your return to London, your immediate retreat into aristocratic comfort, suggests you've learned nothing. You tested her character and found it exemplary. Well done. But did it ever occur to you that she might be testing yours as well, and you, dear nephew, failed spectacularly? How can I possibly repair this? Edmund asked, genuine desperation breaking through his carefully maintained composure. Lady Beatrice studied him over the rim of her teacup. As you begin by actually changing, not simply performing change. You demonstrated in Derbyshire that you can live simply, work honestly, integrate into community. Now prove those months weren't theatre, but genuine transformation. Reform your estates, improve your tenants, conditions. Use your considerable power and resources for actual good, rather than selfish preservation of privilege. And Charlotte, that young woman owes you nothing. If you love her, truly love her, not the convenient maternal figure you originally sought, then you prove it through actions, not words. You demonstrate that the man she knew in Millbrook was real, even if the name was false. Edmund threw himself into estate reform with the fervour of a man seeking redemption through action. He met with tenant representatives, listened to grievances accumulated over generations, implemented changes his steward declared radical, and his fellow peers called dangerously progressive, improved housing conditions, fair wage increases, educational opportunities for workers, children. Each reform felt like partial penance for the damage he'd caused. But nothing filled the void where Charlotte's presence had been, and nothing reached Thomas, who declined daily into shadows Edmund recognized with terrible familiarity. 6 weeks after their return to London, catastrophe struck in the form of scarlet fever. Thomas collapsed during his morning lessons, burning with fever that turned his skin crimson and his breathing labored. The physician arrived within the hour, examined the boy with grave expression, and delivered the diagnosis Edmund had been dreading. Scarlet fever, your grace. We must isolate him immediately and hope his constitution proves strong enough to weather the illness. I won't dissemble. In children this young, the outcome remains uncertain. For 3 days, Thomas lingered in feverish delirium, tossing restlessly in sheets soaked with sweat, calling out incomprehensibly. Edmund maintained vigil beside his son's bed, sponging the boy's forehead with cool water, administering medicine with shaking hands, praying to a god he'd largely ignored throughout his privileged existence. On the 4th night, as Thomas's fever reached its crisis point, the boy's eyes opened briefly, focusing with unexpected clarity on his father's haggard face. "Papa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where's Mama Charlotte? I want Mama Charlotte." Edmund's heart shattered. "She's not here, son. She's far away." "But I need her," Thomas insisted with childish logic that acknowledged no obstacles. "She makes everything better. She knows how to chase the bad dreams away. Please, Papa, please bring her." The physician, standing respectfully distant, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, in cases this severe, the patient's mental state significantly impacts physical recovery. If there's someone whose presence might comfort the child." Edmund made his decision instantly. He summoned his secretary, dictating urgent instructions. "Prepare the fastest coach. I want it ready to depart for Derbyshire within the hour. And send word ahead. Find Charlotte Hartwell in Millbrook and inform her that Thomas is gravely ill and asking for her." The messenger returned 2 days later, while Thomas still fought for each laboured breath. Miss Hartwell departed Millbrook immediately upon receiving word. "Your Grace, she should arrive by this evening." Charlotte appeared at Ashbourne House as twilight fell, still wearing her travel-stained grey dress, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. A footman escorted her to Thomas's sick room, where Edmund sat hunched beside the bed, maintaining his futile vigil. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The enormous bedroom with its velvet curtains, the ornate furniture, the obvious wealth surrounding the small, fragile boy struggling to breathe beneath expensive linens. Her eyes met Edmund's across the lamplight, and he saw anger still burning there, but something else too, concern that transcended personal grievances. "How long has he been like this?" she asked quietly. 5 days. The fever won't break. He keeps calling for you." Charlotte approached the bed, her earlier fury momentarily set aside. She placed her hand gently on Thomas's forehead, and even in his delirium the boy seemed to sense her presence. His restless movements calmed slightly. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Sweet boy, I'm here now." "You came," Edmund said, his voice breaking. "Even after everything I did, you came for him." Charlotte looked at him with eyes full of complex emotions. "I came because a child is suffering, and he asked for me. This doesn't absolve you, Edmund. This doesn't repair what you broke between us, but that innocent boy in this bed bears no responsibility for his father's choices." She settled into the chair opposite Edmund's, taking Thomas's small hand in hers. "I'll stay until the fever breaks. For him. Only for him." Charlotte maintained her vigil for 3 days and nights, leaving Thomas's bedside only when Edmund physically insisted she rest. She sang the simple songs the boy had loved in Millbrook, told stories about the village children he'd played with, promised him he'd return to skip stones in the River Derwent once he recovered. On the 4th morning, Thomas's fever finally broke. He woke lucid and weak, his eyes finding Charlotte immediately. "You're really here. I thought I dreamed you." "I'm really here, sweetheart," she assured him, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead with such natural maternal tenderness that Edmund had to look away, his throat tight with emotion. As Thomas drifted into genuine healing sleep, Charlotte finally turned to Edmund, with the full force of her anger no longer diluted by immediate crisis. "We need to speak. Not here." They moved to the library, where morning light streamed through tall windows, overlooking the manicured gardens. Charlotte stood by the fireplace, her simple dress incongruous among the room's opulent furnishings. "I've had considerable time to think while sitting with Thomas," she began, her voice steady despite obvious exhaustion. "I've examined my anger, my hurt, my sense of betrayal, and I've reached some conclusions." Edmund remained silent, allowing her the space she deserved. "What you did was unconscionable," Charlotte continued. "You manipulated me, tested me, observed my genuine emotions as though I were a performer unaware of her audience. You made me fall in love with you and your son while hiding fundamental truths. That was cruel, Edmund, profoundly cruel." "I know," he said quietly. "I have no defense for my actions. I can only offer apologies that feel inadequate. However," Charlotte said, and something shifted in her expression, "I've also recognized something else. The man I knew in Millbrook, William Gray, he was real. His love for his son was real. His growing affection for me was real. His desire to be better than his aristocratic upbringing demanded was real. You didn't fabricate those things. You simply hid them behind a false name." Edmund's heart began beating faster with cautious hope. "The question becomes," Charlotte continued, "whether you're willing to be that man, not William Gray, but the authentic version of Edmund Ashbourne who learned to value community over status, compassion over privilege. Because if you retreat into being merely a duke again, if those months in Millbrook were temporary performance rather than genuine transformation, then we have nothing to build upon." "They weren't performance," Edmund said urgently. "Charlotte, everything I learned there, everything I became, that was the most honest I've ever been in my entire life. I don't want to be the man I was before. I want to be the man you helped me become." "Then prove it," Charlotte challenged. "Not to me alone, but to everyone. Make your transformation public. Use your position and resources for genuine good. Show England's aristocracy that nobility means service, not merely inherited privilege." 2 weeks later, Edmund stood before an unprecedented assembly in Millbrook's village square. He'd invited not only every tenant and worker from his estates, but also neighbouring landowners, local magistrates, and even several members of Parliament who'd travelled from London at his urgent request. Thomas, still pale but recovering, stood beside him, and Charlotte stood on his other side, her presence there a statement itself. Edmund's voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd. "I stand before you today to publicly acknowledge a deception that brought shame upon myself and pain to people who deserved only honesty. Several months ago, I came to this village disguised as a common tenant, seeking to test whether genuine affection existed uncontaminated by aristocratic privilege." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, London peers exchanging scandalized glances. "And I found that affection," Edmund continued, "particularly from one remarkable woman whose character, intelligence and compassion proved superior to anything my own corrupted class could offer. But I also betrayed her trust, manipulated her emotions, and treated her authentic love as data to be evaluated. For that, I offer public apology and private shame." He turned to Charlotte, speaking directly to her, though his words remained audible to all. "You asked me to prove my transformation was genuine. Therefore, I'm announcing comprehensive reforms across all Ashbourne properties: fair wages, improved housing, educational funding, and profit-sharing arrangements that recognize workers as partners rather than merely labourers." Gasps of shock came from the assembled aristocrats. Lord Wentworth looked positively apoplectic. "Furthermore," Edmund said, his voice strengthening, "I ask Charlotte Hartwell, daughter of Robert Hartwell, weaver of Millbrook, to become my wife, not despite her common origins, but honouring them as representing everything nobility should embody, but too often forgets." Complete silence followed Edmund's proposal. Charlotte stood motionless, her face unreadable, while hundreds of eyes watched, waiting. The moment stretched unbearably until Thomas tugged at her sleeve. "Please say yes, Mama Charlotte," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We need you. Papa needs you. I need you." Charlotte looked down at the boy who'd captured her heart, then at Edmund, who'd broken it before beginning to mend it through genuine transformation. When she spoke, her voice carried across the expectant crowd with remarkable clarity. "I have conditions," she announced. Edmund felt hope surge. Conditions meant negotiation, not outright rejection. "Name them." "First, I will not abandon Millbrook or my father's business. We divide our time equally between your estates and this village. Second, these reforms you've promised become legally binding, not merely aristocratic whimsy that disappears when inconvenient. Third, Thomas receives education that balances aristocratic refinement with genuine humanity. No boarding schools that drain children's souls." "Agreed to all conditions," Edmund said immediately. "And finally," Charlotte continued, her moss-green eyes holding his with fierce intensity, "absolute honesty between us, always. No matter how difficult the truth, no matter how tempting deception might seem, if we build a life together, we build it on truth, not convenient fictions." "I swear it," Edmund vowed. "Complete honesty, always, even when it terrifies me." Charlotte smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd offered him since the disaster of his exposure. "Then yes, Your Grace, I'll marry you. Not for your title, not for your wealth, but because I believe the man who learned to work beside common folk, who valued community over status, who loved his son enough to risk everything. That man is worth loving." The crowd erupted. Villagers cheered while aristocrats stood in stunned disapproval, unable to comprehend a duke marrying so far beneath his station. Edmund didn't care. He pulled Charlotte into his arms, Thomas squealing with joy between them, creating an embrace that felt like the first honest moment of his entire privileged existence. Lady Beatrice Thornbury, observing from her carriage, smiled with satisfaction. "Done finally," she murmured to her companion. "The boy shows some sense." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Millbrook's ancient Norman church, scandalizing London society and delighting the entire village. Charlotte wore a gown of her own weaving, elegant in its simplicity, refusing the elaborate silk confection society expected. Thomas served as ring-bearer, his face glowing with happiness that had seemed impossible mere months before. Edmund spoke his vows with absolute sincerity, meaning every word in ways he never could have before his Millbrook education. Charlotte responded with equal conviction, her voice steady and sure. Their first year of marriage became legend throughout Derbyshire and beyond. They divided time precisely as Charlotte demanded, weeks at Ashbourne House managing the Duke's parliamentary responsibilities and necessary social obligations. Then weeks in Millbrook, where Edmund worked alongside his tenants, and Charlotte continued managing her father's thriving weaving business. The promised reforms became reality. Edmund established schools, improved housing, created cooperative structures that shared profits equitably. Other aristocrats called him radical, dangerous, a traitor to his class. Younger peers, however, began visiting to study his methods, intrigued by the possibility that privilege could coexist with justice. Thomas flourished between two worlds, learning Greek and Latin alongside proper farming techniques, developing into a boy who could navigate Mayfair ballrooms and village celebrations with equal comfort and genuine pleasure. One evening, a year after their wedding, the three of them sat in Blackwood Cottage's small garden, watching stars emerge above the Derbyshire hills. Thomas had fallen asleep against Charlotte's shoulder, exhausted from helping Joseph repair the village well. "Do you regret it?" Edmund asked quietly. "The complications, the social censure, the constant navigation between different worlds." Charlotte smiled, adjusting Thomas more comfortably against her. "I regret nothing. This life is harder than I imagined, more complex, more demanding, but it's also more meaningful than anything I dreamed possible." "I love you," Edmund said. "As not the woman I tested, not the convenient maternal figure I originally sought, but you, Charlotte Hartwell Ashbourne, who refused to let me hide behind either false identity or aristocratic privilege." "And I love you," she replied. "The real you, finally honest, finally authentic, finally brave enough to be vulnerable." They sat in comfortable silence, this unlikely family, bound not by social convention or calculated advantage, but by truth painfully earned and love genuinely given.